what I'm going to show you today will connect, I think, some of the dots of some of the things that you just saw, and actually some of my slides were already shown, so you'll have to forgive me for being repetitive on a couple of these. I want to start, though, with putting this in context. It's important to recognize that if we look at the petroleum age in the context of a long span of time, you can argue whether we're on the upward side of the Hubert curve where we're headed to peak oil, or we're on the back side where we're about to head down the slippery slope. The question, though, is almost irrelevant if you think about it in terms of how long it takes to change an economy from one fuel source to another. And in that kind of a time span, we're basically at peak oil, whether it's 10 years from now or it happened 5 years ago. It doesn't matter. We've got to act as though we are right at the peak today. And this curve, or set of curves, kind of makes that point. This is the set of Marchetti curves that were developed in 1977 and then revised, or actually verified again, by a BP study in 2007. And this was looking at all different types of energy economies and shifting from wood to coal and coal to petroleum and so forth. Basically, the conclusion is it takes about 50 years to shift an economy to make a dramatic move toward another energy source and be able to put the infrastructure in place to use that. So in that scale, you basically have to start things very quickly. Otherwise, you're on that backside of the Hubert curve where increasing costs have diminishing returns. And that's a difficult equation to try to balance. And then we also have to think about these technologies in terms of how they fit in the development cycle or the infrastructure deployment cycle. This is a look at the fuel prices that were occurring between 2001 and 2008. You can see that there were shocks up in price and shocks down in price. Both of those are bad. What we want is some predictability to this, because the vehicles that were on the road in 2008 when we saw that price shock were developed 4 to 5 years before that. It takes 4 years to develop a new powertrain, a new vehicle, and put it on the road. That's assuming the technology is ready. So this is something we got to keep in mind. Stable policy and keeping on the course toward developing these technologies and putting them on the road is something that can't go with just the current price at the pump or the current political perspective on the technology. We also have to think about this, and you saw this. This is a little bit different look at some of the charts that Sandy showed. We're looking at petroleum consumption on the left chart and greenhouse gas emissions on the right chart. And this was an analysis that we went through internally to basically look at, with the growth of the car park over time, what would you expect the fuel consumption in terms of petroleum usage and then the greenhouse gases to look like? And that's basically that upward slope that you see above the shaded light blue area at the top of the chart. All of the changes that we can make towards shifting to smaller vehicles in terms of mix, and also improvements to the base, more conventional powertrain technologies like internal combustion engines and transmissions, lightweighting the vehicles, all of that work at best over the period between now and 2050 would be able to just hold the line in terms of petroleum consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. So if we target this goal of trying to get to an 80% reduction from 1990 levels, that means you need a combination of all of these advanced technologies to be able to make the improvements that we're talking about with reducing petroleum consumption and also lowering greenhouse gas emissions. So at General Motors, we develop a portfolio approach. We have the vertical axis here is improvements in fuel economy as well as reductions in emissions and displaced petroleum. And over time, these different technologies start to integrate into the portfolio and find their way onto the road. So there will continue to be internal combustion engines and transmissions, but you'll see the hybrids as they have been gaining strength. Then we move into the plug-in hybrids because that allows us to bring in other energy sources off of the grid, and then eventually bringing in the hydrogen fuel cell, which is an essential element to this advanced propulsion portfolio. And I also want to show on the bottom of this chart that we have an energy diversity strategy that we're executing within GM. And this is the goal of trying to diversify the number of energy sources that we can use for personal mobility. And these infrastructure investments need to come along with the propulsion technologies. You can't have one without the other. So I like to use this chart. This is actually one of our precious fuel cell vehicles. I did not endorse this use for the vehicle. I actually haven't found the driver that was using it at the time, but they're moving a couch with our vehicle here. The reason I like to use this slide, though, is it emphasizes the point that our customers expect no compromises. We're talking about new technologies, but they expect these vehicles to do the things that they've always done with their vehicles in the past. And we have to consider that. And one of the important things we need to think about is range. And you saw some charts that Sandy showed earlier. This is another way to look at that. On the left-hand side of the chart is diesel fuel, and how much diesel fuel you have to package on the vehicle to get a 300-mile range. Range is an important characteristic of the vehicle that the customer demands. And what we can see there is petroleum fuel is a very efficient way of storing energy on a vehicle. About 33 kilograms of diesel fuel will give you that 300-mile range, and about 43 kilograms after you package it on the vehicle with a tank and all the other pieces will ensure that range to the customer. About 6 kilograms of hydrogen can give you that same range, but we have the added requirement to package a compressed gas on board, which brings that up to about 125 kilograms. And the volume is the other aspect of this. There needs to be enough space on board to package this energy so that we can establish the 300-mile range. And a lithium-ion battery, with all the improvements that have been made in the past, they've mostly been made in cost and mass improvement, not in volume. And even on the mass side, it's still a big penalty to try to put 300 miles of range in with a lithium-ion battery. So this chart, which is a version of the chart that you saw earlier, this chart shows how we look at the customer demands by application and how different technologies can satisfy different needs of customers. All customers are not the same. All vehicle applications are not the same. So we need to think about them in the context of how the vehicles are used. So this chart, we look at it, and on the left-hand side is stop-and-go city operation. On the right-hand side is more continuous over-the-highway type operation. And if you're living on the left side of this chart, that's where the regenerative braking of a hybrid technology works very well, because you can capture that energy, store it, and use it to launch the vehicle on the next acceleration. If you're on the right-hand side of this chart, you're mostly doing something like across the country driving with a Class 8 truck, a big, big truck. You're mostly running at higher speeds for long periods of time, and you're not stopping very often. So the advantages of having a hybrid powertrain in those vehicles is minimized. Instead, I'm carrying a lot of extra mass and cost in the propulsion system, so that's not really a good thing. The vertical part of this chart is looking at the load. So how much energy, how much power does it take to move these vehicles? Big vehicles take more power. So think about it here as the load is high on the top of the chart, and it's light load on the bottom part of the chart. Light load is very well satisfied with advanced gasoline technology, and on the top part of the chart, that's where a diesel can extend its advantages in efficiency up to 40 to 70% in terms of the gasoline engine. But if we add the electrification of the vehicle on top of this, and this is the chart that you saw, what you can see is you can't beat the BEV if you're staying in a very small car for very low speed operation and limited range. It is a very efficient powertrain. But if you want to go further or travel faster or go into larger vehicles or start to carry a cargo, that's where you need to do something. And this extended range electric vehicle that we're using in the Chevrolet Volt is one way to offset some of the limitations of the battery electric technology and push it out a little bit further. And that's how come you can see the EREV technology starting to move out into slightly higher speed operation and slightly larger vehicles. But it also has its limits. Once you've used up that inherent advantage of the low-cost electricity, now you're carrying two propulsion systems, an internal combustion engine and an electric drive system, and that's a big penalty to live with. So that's where the fuel cell really shines. The fuel cell can do things that other technologies can't by moving into the higher speed parts of the load and driving cycle and bigger vehicles. So I wanted to just give you a sense of what we've been doing with the real world with these vehicles and how that relates to some of what we need to do in the future. We put the world's largest fleet of vehicles on the road in real customer hands. We put 119 vehicles out on the road, and they've been driving with 80 people using these as their own personal use vehicle.